8 inches long, licks its eyes clean, and can climb up glass walls. It's the leaf-tailed gecko. Reptiles have been walking the earth for millions of years and are able to adapt to almost any environment. We'll find out more about these amazing and resilient creatures. Let's take note with Clyde Peeling, owner of Reptiland, a Pennsylvania zoo specializing in reptiles and amphibians. It's located in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. Mr. Peeling has worked with reptiles and amphibians for more than 40 years and lectures extensively on the topic throughout the U.S. Thanks so much for joining us.
Nice to be here, Patty.
Reptiland is something of a Pennsylvania landmark. What prompted you to start it?
I had an interest in reptiles from the time I was about 11 or 12 years old. And when I was a young man, there was a place called Reptiland, of all things, about 15 miles south of where I'm now located in Winfield. And I went to work there as a teenager. And while I was in the military, that place went out of business because they widened the highway. And so I came out of the service in 1964 and decided I would build a place nearby and keep the same name. So that's kind of the story of how we have the name Reptiland, and sometimes I kind of regret that name because it almost sounds like a roadside zoo and has a bit of a stigma attached to it, but I hope we've overcome that over the years.
Well, speaking a bit of a stigma, reptiles and amphibians are in terms of classes of animals, they're the more maligned animals on the planet.
I think they are probably amongst the most hated, feared, and misunderstood of all living creatures. And I think to some extent that's changing. When I started in business almost 40 years ago, there were a lot of people who came into my place with all kinds of misunderstandings. People who believed in hoop snakes and snakes with stingers on the end of the tail and whatever. I don't get that much anymore, and I think that's probably due to PBS. Due to Discovery Channel, Animal Planet, many books that are on the market today that just weren't available when I started in business.
Well, let's introduce people to this. This is the leaf-tailed gecko, and it originates in Madagascar. Tell me about this.
Well, Madagascar, first of all, is an island in great jeopardy, and just about every living creature and plant on that island is threatened by extinction. This particular gecko is a rainforest animal, and he plasters himself against a rainforest tree and can flatten himself so flat that it's virtually impossible to pick him out. Even in the exhibit at Reptiland, when you look in the cage, you may have difficulty finding this animal and all of his brothers and sisters unless you look very carefully. The tail, of course, is very flattened. That isn't for any purpose other than to make him difficult to see, make him cryptic against his background. An interesting feature, first of all, we'll talk about a little bit about the toes here. Every toe is covered with hundreds of thousands of hair-like projections, and they feel like suction cups, as you know.
They did.
But in fact, molecular bonding allows him to cling to smooth surfaces. He can walk up glass, he can walk upside down on the ceiling, no problem at all. The eyes are very well designed for living and hunting at night, and they have an elliptical pupil like many animals that hunt after dark. And most people maybe don't realize why a nocturnal animal has the elliptical pupil, but it's because they have a very sensitive retina. It's like a high-speed film. And to protect the retina, they have to close this down into a slit during the daytime to protect the retina, and then at night, it opens up wide and allows more light in than would be normal for, say, most mammals.
Now, reptiles shed. Does this gecko, will it shed its skin? And what about its tail?
They shed the epidermis, the very outer covering of the skin. And in the case of lizards, they shed in little pieces here and there. And in the case of snakes, they start at the head and it peels inside out back over the body in one piece.
But its tail could fall off, right?
If you grab him by the tail, you'll find you're holding a tail.
And it will grow back.
It will regenerate, but it will never look as attractive as the original. I hate to break them off because it ruins the appearance of the animal forever.
Now, in the last 40 years, you have been on expeditions to Africa, India, the Galapagos. First of all, tell me what those areas are like in terms of these creatures. to what extent is their habitat disappearing? And how did you come up with the collection that you have at Reptiland?
Well, there's two different answers. When I do the trips, I generally lead a group of people. For example, next March, we're going to take a group to the Galapagos Islands. I've done probably 16, 17 trips to the Amazon, half a dozen to Africa, India, so on. But primarily we go to look at the animals, to watch them. Maybe sometimes we'll catch them, release them. And the question, how are those areas doing? In most cases, not well. I have seen deterioration in the Amazon over the past 30 years of going there. And I'll give you one example, a little place called Leticia, Colombia, where Brazil, Colombia, and Peru meet on the Amazon, was once a little jungle town with no roads leading outside of town. There was no place to go. It has now become deforested for many, many miles around that village. The streets are paved. Everyone in town has a car, no place to go except drive around town, but they have a car. The drug business has become very big there. And that is happening throughout much of the Amazon. Logging, deforestation. It's still the biggest intact rainforest in the world, but it's disappearing.
And how did you come up with your collection? How big is your collection at Reptiland?
We have about somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 species, 50 different types or kinds. But there are many more than one of each species. So I would say the collection at Reptiland is around 200 animals at any given time. Where do we get them? Most of them come from other zoos where they're bred or hatched in captivity. And some of them, of course, we have hatch or they're born right there at Reptiland. Very few of them these days are imported from the wild. We don't want to contribute to the depletion of a wild population. It's a lot of red tape getting them out of a country of origin into our country. And a captive-born animal is just a much easier animal to keep in captivity.
You brought another one, the green tree python.
Let me show you quickly. Here's a beautiful snake. Even if you don't like snakes, I think you'd have to agree this is a gorgeous snake. It's called a green tree python. It comes from New Guinea and northern Australia. And this is a case of convergent evolution. There's another snake called an emerald tree boa, which looks almost identical. If I had one next to the snake, even an expert might have a bit of a difficult time telling which is which. But they're not closely related. They're distantly related, of course, but they've converged upon the same strategy of survival, which is that they have this green coloration to match the leaves of the canopy where they live. They have the little specks of white which resemble bird droppings, so that if a hawk or an eagle is soaring above, it's less apt to spot this animal in the canopy of the rainforest.
In fact, these amphibians, reptiles rather, have survived millions of years. Are they among the most adaptable creatures on the planet?
Well, I suppose you'd have to say that all living things have had the same amount of time, evolutionary time, to evolve. And it's hard to say that one is better adapted than another. If it is extant, if it still survives, then it must be well adapted or it would have gone extinct. And there are probably 1,000 times more animals that are extinct than are now existing on this planet. It appears as though, all creatures or plants have a time when they evolve, a time when they kind of remain in stasis, not much happens, and then they go extinct. So I suppose that's true for our species eventually as well. I
think of a python as an enormous snake, and so I'm wondering just how old is the snake you're holding?
This snake is probably a year and a half old. When they first, in this case, they hatch from an egg. In the case of the one that I mentioned, the emerald tree boa, they come from an egg, but the female retains the egg in the oviducts, and the baby is born alive. This snake will get up to about 6 or 7 feet in length, but because they always coil tightly on a branch, it'll never appear as though the snake is nearly that long, even as an adult.
Now, the gecko you see today, the gecko as a house pet, and more reptiles are being sold as pets. From your standpoint, is that a good idea?
Well, it's hard for me to criticize that too much because that's how I got interested by keeping them in captivity. But I can tell you there are some animals, some reptiles that are much better suited for captivity than others. And if somebody wanted, for example, a lizard for a pet, I probably would not recommend most geckos, but there's one called a leopard gecko from Afghanistan, which is wonderful. It's a small creature. You can keep it in a 10-gallon aquarium, and it's quite comfortable. It will always defecate in the same corner, and it's just an easy animal to keep. Another one would be a bearded dragon from Australia. They're fairly good pets. This particular gecko would not make a good pet.
And why is that?
Primarily because they are very sensitive to temperature change. They have a very breakable tail, as we mentioned. They're just animals that require more husbandry experience than most kids, for example, have the savvy to take care of them properly.
Now, the brain of a reptile, I've read, is less than 1% of its body mass, and my guess is that for a pet to be a satisfying pet, it would require a certain amount of intelligence for bonding and that sort of thing. Is that the case?
If you're looking for a pet that will fetch the paper, roll over, or whatever, you better get a dog. And I always say dogs and cats make the best pets, and that's true, they do. But if you want a reptile or an amphibian for a pet, then I would suggest that you not handle it very much. These are not animals that respond to handling for the most part. People keep boa constrictors and they handle them, and boas will tolerate quite a bit of handling. But generally speaking, it stresses the animals out, and they're better just observed in a terrarium or a vivarium and not handled to a great extent. They're not pets that become affectionate with you.
Okay, we have just a couple of seconds remaining. What are the greatest threats facing amphibians and reptiles today?
Well, habitat destruction, without a doubt, is the greatest threat. Also, the hide industry, the leather industry, has taken a great toll on many species of snakes and lizards and crocodilians throughout the world. But I think habitat destruction is the real answer.
You have some show and tell with you. This is a cane toad.
This is a cane toad, or sometimes called the marine toad, which is kind of a misnomer. The Latin name is Bufo marinus, and this is not a marine animal. I don't know quite what happened when they named him, but he's very much a terrestrial creature. Of course, all toads are frogs, and this is certainly among the larger species. It's the largest of what we call toads. The biggest frog in the world is called the Goliath frog from Africa, which gets probably twice this size. And
you're talking about a toad in your hand, which is probably 2 pounds or so.
I don't think he goes quite that.
It looks like a dinner plate.
Everyone tends to exaggerate the size of reptiles and amphibians for some reason.
So toads and frogs are really the same thing?
All toads are frogs. Frogs aren't toads. Generally, in our country at least, when we say toad, we're talking about a terrestrial frog that has, instead of slimy skin, has a more waterproof skin, if you will, and has these large parotoid glands right here which contain poison. And if a dog, for example, bites down on a toad, he probably won't make the same mistake twice because it's going to be very painful for him. Probably wouldn't kill him unless he tried to eat it, but he'd remember the experience.
What's the difference between an amphibian, which is the toad of course is, and a reptile?
Well, reptiles, let me say that amphibians were the first land animals. They left the water, they solved a couple of problems which had to be solved in order to survive on land. They developed lungs for breathing as opposed to gills for extracting oxygen from water. But they always had to go back to water to reproduce, or at least they have to lay their eggs in moist places. And because the eggs are so small and they're just kind of a gelatin-like covering, they desiccate quickly. So they hatch into a tadpole, they go through a fish-like phase, and then they finally metamorphose into a miniature of their parents. Well, reptiles came along 200 million years ago, and they developed the enclosed egg, the amniote egg, which meant that the egg could number one, have a lot of yolk inside for food for the growing embryo, which means that the embryo really has its own pond, but it's enclosed within the egg, and that meant they could lay these eggs away from water and exploit land areas that amphibians can't. Amphibians have very permeable skin. Reptiles have more waterproof skin. A frog is probably, well, let me put it another way, a lizard maybe is 10 times more waterproof than a frog. You won't find frogs generally basking in the sun. You will find lizards out basking in the sun.
And of course that waterproof attribute is part of what makes them attractive reptiles, that is, in the leather industry.
That's correct. The scales are beautifully marked in many cases, and it's unfortunate because very few reptiles are actually bred in captivity for the purpose of producing leather.
The way we do with mink and that sort of thing.
That's right. The only exception I can think of are crocodiles and alligators. If you find a pair of boots or a handbag made from snake skin or lizard skin, or even, believe it or not, toad skin, those were wild-caught animals killed for that purpose.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago the poison in the glands of this toad. And poison, we've all heard about poison being put on the end of darts, blow darts, and in fact you brought one with you. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, actually all amphibians have toxic skin to one degree or another. Don't panic because if mothers are out there thinking, oh my gosh, my kids pick up toads, that's not really dangerous, but they are mildly toxic and it helps to protect them. Some of them have really carried this to the extreme. In western Ecuador, there's a little poison dart frog called the terrible dart frog, and it has the second most toxic substance known to man. And the Indians, the Chaco Indians in that area, take their darts and they rub it over the skin of the animal, and that's enough to poison the tip of the dart. And then if they're hunting monkeys, they'll usually put a little notch right behind the tip so that when it hits the monkey will reach back and pull it and it'll break off and the dart tip will remain in the monkey and paralyze him and he'll fall out of the tree. This is something that's used throughout much of the Amazon, and some places they use other things to poison the darts besides the frogs. And some frogs are not as toxic as that animal that I just mentioned, and they actually skewer the frog, put it over a flame, and it exudes the toxin, which then tips the dart. After they've done that, then they take the cotton from a kapok tree and they can wrap that around the dart like this, and that creates a seal. That is then fed into the tail end. Of course, I haven't tightened that up as much as I should have, but that enables the dart to go in like this. The Indian then holds the blowgun in this position, and I'm going to get your cameraman.
No poison on the end of that dart. Don't worry, Dave.
But they're remarkably accurate. I've seen them shoot birds at 30, 40 feet.
Well, the wind, I would think, that's required to get that dart out of there with any force must be fierce.
You have to give it a very short, powerful blast, and it's something you can pick up very quickly, and it's almost instinctual. Maybe half a dozen tries, and almost anyone here could become fairly accurate using this blowgun.
We started off this program by talking about how quickly we're seeing rainforests disappear, and you note in some of your lectures that the tropical rainforests that straddle the equator have the most diverse plant and animal life found anywhere. Just what's the situation with regard to that habitat?
E.O. Wilson, who is an entomologist at Harvard, says that we are currently losing about 28,000 species a year. He bases that on his studies in the Amazon rainforest. Basically, they will take maybe 1 acre and they will fog all the trees in that area just to collect the insects and the invertebrates and the frogs and so on, and determine how many species they have in that given section, and then they extrapolate that, And what he's basing it on is that because of this rapid deforestation, we're cutting down the rainforest, we're losing animals we haven't even named yet at an alarming rate.
And in fact, to put it in terms that might mean something to Westerners, 25% of Western pharmaceuticals were derived from plants and animals in the rainforest, and only about 1% have even been identified. So the potential in terms of health care, 99% of it has been unrealized at this point.
If we need a selfish reason to save it, that's one. It also, of course, has been shown that the rainforest produces a lot of oxygen, which our species needs to survive, as well as others. And but I would say that just because something has beneficial uses to man is not, that shouldn't be the only requirement to save it from extinction.
Shouldn't be the motivation.
Yes, that's right.
That toad is about to escape, and I have a couple more questions about it, so maybe you can
He's just looking over the edge. It'll be fine.
The cane toad, it's an interesting story about it. It was actually introduced into Australia to control a pest problem. Cane, sugar cane, had some kind of a beetle, and it turns out it wasn't very successful in
It's amazing. They brought the cane toad from South America, where it's indigenous, to Australia, thinking that it would, as you said, eat cane beetles. Well, the problem is beetles fly, toads don't. And they didn't eat so many cane beetles, but they did eat a lot of native wildlife, and they just decimated other species of toads and frogs and various invertebrate species. An interesting side note, somebody also imported to Australia the large the beetles that roll feces, the dung beetles.
Oh, okay, right.
And the toads don't get the beetles, but they do produce a lot of feces. So right behind the toads, you've got these dung beetles following, rolling up these balls of fecal matter. And both of these have been introduced to Australia.
It's interesting, the unintended consequences of, the good intention here was that we were going to rid one problem with a natural means, and it's gone awry.
Well, we've done it all over the world. Just about everywhere you go, you'll find introduced plants, and we're all guilty of it. I mean, we plant exotics in our gardens, and sometimes they get out of hand. Japanese knotweed is a good example. Mm-hmm. It's everywhere.
What do you feed that cane toad?
We feed him mice, actually. It's hard to believe, but this fellow can eat an adult mouse or even a small rat. And he gets very tired of crickets because they're so small. It's like a baby in a boxcar here.
And does it need to be fed several times a day? Or is this a creature that eats like a bird, for example?
He probably eats about once every other day. These are cold-blooded animals, as are reptiles, and consequently, for the most part, they burn up a lot less energy than we do. 70% of everything we consume is just used to stoke the furnace. In the case of amphibians or reptiles, since they're cold-blooded, they can get by on far smaller quantity of food than can mammals.
With just a couple of seconds remaining, can you just give us an idea of what you hope to accomplish through Reptiland and the lectures that you do?
Well, I think we've always had the goal of trying to change attitudes about these animals to make people understand that while they may not love them, they have a place here, they're important to the ecological balance, and there's no reason to kill the next snake or lizard or whatever it is that you come across, that these animals belong here too.
All right, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
We've been talking with Clyde Peeling, the owner and operator of Reptiland in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. If you have story ideas for Take Note, we'd love to hear from you. Send them to Take Note, that's Wagner Annex, University Park, Pennsylvania, 16802. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.